Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Baithak. And in today's episode, we have with us Professor Rukmini Nair. Now, Professor Rukmini, I am very terrible with introductions, and I try my best to give your introduction. And I'm especially afraid to give your introduction because over the years you've gathered so much. Like you've gathered such a long introduction that it's almost impossible for me to give a proper introduction of yours.
Actually, Sath, can I just say that, nowadays nobody has private life, so everything is
Yeah,
online. So maybe this introduction can be very, very brief indeed.
sure,
And
sure.
we can take it from there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'll probably attach your web pages and website in the description down below so that people could look up your research work and know more about you. Uh,
Hmm.
what I could say right now is Professor Nair is a poet, and she has a very prestigious title attached to her. That is, she is the first significant postmodern poet in Indian English. And she definitely is a professor. She has been a visiting professor at Stanford and a professor at IIT Delhi. Her research work and what she teaches can be categorized under the umbrella term of cognitive linguistics. Am I correct?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, one thing I'm not sure is that do you still teach at IIT Delhi?
Yes, I am teaching, but I'm an emeritus professor now.
Oh, okay,
But
okay.
it's a full-time teaching job, a
Yeah,
paid full-time teaching job. So
yeah,
I'm teaching.
yeah. Let's start now with the questions. The first question which I wanted to ask uh, is this topic about language and thoughts, right? So are these interconnected in some way? Like, are thoughts and language dependent on each other? And like also the language that we speak and the language that we think in, like what's the relationship between these and our thoughts?
So I think these are both good and profound questions. And so let me try to begin with a concrete example.
Yeah,
In the 16th century, the Emperor Akbar tried an experiment which is documented by Abul Fazl, who was his court historian.
yeah,
Now, Akbar, as you know, was the only one of the great Mughals who was formally illiterate.
okay,
But all the others, Humayun wrote poetry and they had libraries and so on. But Akbar somehow missed out on a formal education. So his court historian had to do a lot of work, but he was very interested in the relationship between language and thought. And so
hmm,
he performed an experiment which Abul Fazl documented, and it was sometime uh, uh, in the month of August in the 16th century. I don't remember the date, but maybe 1582, 92, around that.
yeah,
Okay. And, or maybe earlier, a bit earlier. And what he did is an experiment which we are not allowed to conduct today with good reason,
hmm,
but he took some children and shut them up in a gun mahal, and he said that they could be fed with wet nurses. They were well nourished and so on, but these nurses were forbidden to talk to them. So not a single word should be uttered to these infants, but they would be looked after in physical terms.
okay,
So after 4 years, which is, as you know, the period of language development when children acquire a full syntax, uh, Akbar went to check on these infants and what language they had acquired. And in his mind, one question was, will they speak Farsi, which will be the language of God? Will they be Sanskrit? After all, he was living in the multicultural um, setting of India, even
yeah,
then,
yeah,
and multilingual situation of India. So he was very disappointed, and Abul Fazl actually sort of records this disappointment because he says that all that came from that house, Gun Mahal, the house of silence, was the noise of weeping and wailing. So these children
hmm,
had not acquired language and their thought processes, as we know from modern uh, accounts of wolf children and genie in the United States, uh, did had a limited capacity for thought, but then you must ask, or very little capacity to express their thoughts. But then you must ask, what is thought?
Yeah.
And there you have to see what are the elements of thought that you will include in thinking. For example, if you're walking down a street, let's say in Mumbai or in your campus, right? Uh, you may be walking silently. There may not be thoughts, linguistic thoughts in your head, but your brain is a recording machine. So it will have lights, sounds, impressions, footsteps behind you. It will record all this to some extent, not fully because memory is fallible, but to some extent. Have you been thinking? I would get that at some level you have been thinking because your mind is active and operating as in dreams.
Yes.
But maybe you are not using your master file of language to put these together. So you do think without language. We do think without expressing everything according to Searle's principle of expressibility, but we don't have the capacity, which is the ability to merge and connect complex thoughts. There's just one more thing I want to say, which you might find provocative. Which
no, ma'am.
is
No,
that,
go on.
no problem. You don't need language to survive. My contention is you can eat, drink, learn to feed yourself, do everything. So then you have to ask the evolutionary question, which came first, thought or language? And we know we have a rough timeline from, fossil remains and so on for the evolution of language. And we know about 50, 60,000 years ago, the hyoid was in the place where people could have exchanged simple sounds. Okay, and writing came only 5,000, 6,000 years ago. So there is a 2 million history of the evolution of language, right? And before that, was there thought? I would say yes, if you were surviving, if you were walking forward, if you were looking at things, you had forms of thought. And those forms of thought continue to march alongside language. So as a linguist who specializes in pragmatics and cognition, I would like to say that language works in tandem with all our other modalities: sight, sound, hearing. And hearing and speaking are actually connected with language, and we have a feedback loop. So we are talking about a very complex process, Sarthak, and I would say, yes, we do think without language. Babies, when they reach out for something, are thinking.
Yeah.
But it's a very rudimentary thought. And from that rudimentary base of sense impressions and other things, the language bio program unfolds, and by the fourth year, we have acquired all aspects of syntax, mostly if we are talking within a normal range, and we can look at other examples as well. So yeah, I would say yes, we think without language. No, we don't have complex syntactic recursive thoughts which we can exchange.
Yeah.
For that we need language. For communication, we need language. But for very basic survival, we do not need language.
Yeah.
I hope this is not a too long-winded an answer, but language is such a vast field, and what's going on in our minds is so complicated.
Like, I never knew that Akbar was a psychologist as well. So
yes. But that's the thing. We do need to read our historical texts. As in the
Yeah.
Kena, people are wondering, Kene Shitam Patita Preshitam Mana Kena Prana Pratama Pratiyukta. They're asking, how is the mind compelled towards its object?
Yeah.
How do we think? What do the eyes see? So they are asking, in 1500 BC, and all over, I'm not saying in India alone, all over the world, human communities were walking, talking, and so on. And people were asking these questions. And I'm sure much before the Cana, which is one of the oldest texts we have.
Yeah.
So people asking, why? Why do we talk? What makes us think? So you're asking questions which I think are relevant for research as well. And maybe we can get onto that topic.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next question. It's just a follow-up to this only. Like we were talking about languages and thoughts. So if you could expand a bit into if languages could increase our thinking capabilities, like if do languages nurture as an individual, do they nurture my creativity, do they help in that, and for the society, how does language nurture the culture?
Yeah, again, these are big and profound questions, and linguists have two different positions on it. One idea is that this is a problem of what's called word to words fit or words to world fit. Now, when we are children, we have a words to world fit. That is, the world is there, and we acquire our language sort of borrowing from that word. And this is itself a very complicated cognitive act. So for think of a mother. She's bringing up her child and she's saying, Dekho chidiya. Okay, she's pointing and saying, Dekho chidiya. Can you hear me, Sathik? So now the child has a very complex task to accomplish, because the didactic finger is pointing in a general direction. But which object is she looking at? Is it the branch of the tree that she is indicating, or the chidiya? And it takes the child repeated tries to master, to actually infer what is the chidiya, because she has to do a lot of selection, thought work. Okay. Now, why words to world? Because the chidiya will be different in different countries. So, for example, the chidiya may be a robin in England, it may be a kawa here, or a maina. So this way, the concept, now, one thing we must remember, we don't have something like a chidiya in the world. The abstract type chidiya. We only have kawa, maina, etc. So conceptually, what our language is doing across the world, we are getting a type, which is chidiya, but we have only seen specific examples of chidiyas, and those worlds differ a lot across culture. So different cultures, and this is called the problem of linguistic relativism, have different ways of categorizing the world, because the world around them is different. But we all are human. Our genetic material is roughly 99% the same. So we do have much of cognitive apparatus is the same, but the world is different. Now, as we climb up the ladder of language, we become very, very creative with language. And we have to now see, what do we mean by creativity? We can make jokes in language. We can make puns in language. We can, like IIT guys, will mix two languages, Hindi and English, and say funda, funde. Okay, so we can do all sorts of magic tricks with language, right? So in that sense, we develop forms of creativity which we don't think of as creative, but the culture is in fact being extremely creative in sharing information through all these different channels of behavior. So different channels, and we can use gesture, we can use are now emoticons virtually. All these are forms of creativity. Now, creativity has many characteristics. I have listed in my work, I have thought of 9. If you want me to tell you more about creativity, I can. I want you to understand that creativity, again, is something which, different cultures interpret differently. But creativity is not only high level language creativity.
Okay.
Creativity is, according to Chomsky, every human being is highly creative. Why? Because they never speak the same sentence twice. One. Two, they can take all the 20, 30,000 words. This is my example.
Yeah.
20, 30,000 words in their heads. And syntax is so powerful that it can combine all these words together in one long sentence. That means I can say Ram met Sita, Ram, who was tall and something, met Sita, who was going to the market. Then they were eating golgappas together. So imagine your creativity, which language harnesses. It takes a very complicated word and makes a chain of it. Then you cut that chain into slices, like sentences, and remember, and sounds, and phonemes, morphemes, and remember the world that way. So, in that sense, every culture will, I might use Ram ate Golgappas with Sita, and somebody else will use some other thing. But everybody has certain resources like eating, sleeping, dreaming, which are common across cultures. And that's already a huge store for us to make cultural contact and not be locked inside our culture, because communicating is creative, because you're making new sentences all the time. That's a sense in which we are all creative. Then there's another type of creativity which Margaret Burton calls historical creativity. Okay. Einstein was creative. He had to find a language, or Newton had to find a language to describe the forces of gravity, a mathematical language. That is historically creative. Or Kabir was historically creative. Cultures recognize that some people are very creative, but all people who know the cultural ins and outs can kind of manipulate or strategize or delight in different sorts of creativity, and they're always combining modalities. So language does not march alone, is what I said to you.
Yeah.
Sight, sound, hearing, singing. That involves the vocal cords and so on. It's highly creative. We take great delight in it. Painting. So creativity in the arts, sciences, they all involve 2 or 3 factors out of the 9 that I've listed. And I will say risk-taking is one. True, the really, and I think in India, especially in IIT systems and all, maybe we don't teach students to take enough risks. Make a metaphor, make a pun, go out with language and tease people with language. So that is risk-taking, experiencing a eureka moment, finding the appropriate type of language, aesthetics for your creativity. Even code, writing code is a type of language. And that's why I think Satya Nadella, who's CEO of Microsoft, said poetry is the best code. Why did he say that? Because Sankshet mein, you can say lots of things and put it together, and that's a model for writing code. So you see all these aspects of language, they kind of are doing this complex cognitive dance in your head with each other.
Also, they mean different things for different people, these quotes and poems.
That's right. They mean different things. So this interpretation, very good you brought it up, because language is dyadic, you and
Yeah.
me, and polyphonic, lots of people participating. So we always interpret and we get things wrong in our interpretation. And because language is flexible, we can sort out that the interpretive aspect. But one of the things is, like you see, recently we had an IIT teacher only yesterday. She was abusing her students, right? Okay. Now, you are not, there's a huge moral question involved here, which we sort out through language, with power relations in language, like whether you say aap or tu or tum. These are all power relations marked out in the grammar of a language. But imagine, so she is calling her student these terrible names, which we are not even allowed to utter because of normative reasons. But then we must ask the further question, how do you think about this sort of activity? People get insulted if you say bad things about their mother or their sister, yeah? But you're not actually hurting their mother or sister. You're only using a form of words. So, are we hurt? Why are we hurt by it? Why are we emotionally aroused by it? That brings us to a very important aspect of language, that language emotionally, in singing, dancing, arts, creativity, talk, can rouse us to the point of anger. We see this in political talk, we see it everywhere, right? That we get very het up. So that means in our brain, there are connections between words uttered and emotional centers. And that is our deep investment in language. And it's very kind of it's a puzzle. Like, why is emotion so integrated with language? Why can't we separate out thoughts from emotions? But we find that the wiring is such that the forebrain, the amygdala, and so on are all connected. And so that's why, modeling it in machines is such an issue. Now, machines can write poetry, Sarthak, very well if we program them, and very good poetry. And if this was another conversation, I would be kind of giving you tests, which I give my students, to say, was this written by a computer or an actual human being? And mostly the student haiku, and they can't say. Most of the time, it's like 50%. It's random. So if I get 4, then they will get 2 right. But that's kind of random. They never get all right. So, but so this we can do for short forms like haiku. We can't do it for long forms. So so that brings us to a very interesting question. Are computers the next generation of our children? Which is a very difficult thought, but people have it if you're doing cognitive linguistics particularly.
We'll get to that question a bit later. Somehow I'll try to introduce it. One thing which I didn't get in between, you quoted Chomsky saying that no, people do not repeat the sentences, something like that. No two same sentences.
Well, maybe that's a repetition. That's an interpretation of Chomsky, because Chomsky actually said that from a finite number of resources, you get an infinite, so finite number of rules and finite number of phonemes and morphemes and so on. You get the ability to create an infinite number of new sentences. Okay. So he didn't say you'll never repeat it. That was an interpretation, but I can tell you why I said that. It's supposing I say to you, I'll see you tomorrow, Sarthak. Then I will say, I will not get that exact intonation, that exact patterning, those exact suprasegmentals ever again. They will be roughly similar, but not exact. absolutely similar. So in that
Okay.
sense, I meant
Okay.
that the various levels, tone,
Yeah. So the way you are
mirth,
saying it.
etc. The way you are saying it, and what, so you might say some things like goodbye, hello, namaste
Hmm.
at the beginning and end of sentences,
Hmm.
but most of it in between you are creating, and the
Yeah.
words are therefore never the same.
Yeah.
So you can try this experiment. You go home and you write down what happened, and I write down what happened. Obviously, the event is the same.
Yeah.
We are going to produce different accounts. Although the physical event is the same, our perspectives, our locations are different,
Yeah.
and we will not use the same vocabulary, the same syntax, the same
Yeah.
perceptual apparatus to do this. And that's why I'm saying that we are infinitely uh, creative and non repetitive with
Hmm.
language.
Sure. So, moving on to the next question, it's this research interest that was written in your webpage. It was about truth,
Really?
lies, and metaphors,
Yeah.
right? So, this study of deception, it was written that you were studying about deception, the art of deception. So, how are we, like, what evolutionary advantages do we have when we say that we are deceptive? We know that, right? So what is that evolutionary psychological, like, that kind of an advantage we get?
Advantage
Yeah.
with which lies give you. And again, that's an excellent question. And the concomitant question is, can you lie without language?
Hmm.
And of course, you can. For example, you can look very interested in a class
Yeah.
and lean forward, but you're really not listening at all because your mind is somewhere else,
The body
right?
language.
So the body language is a very important, and that's something I study because I
Hmm.
study language in actual situations. But to go back to the question about the lie, so we find deception in nature everywhere. For example, the patterning on tigers and panthers and so on show the pattern of light and shadow, right?
Hmm.
Eyes on a butterfly's wing to frighten. So we know that deception exists across nature. But what advantage does it give us? So, to begin with this, let me just say a lie formally has to have three characteristics.
Okay.
One, it must assert something false.
Hmm.
Two, the speaker must believe the speaker must know that she is asserting something uh,
False.
false, and she must have an intention to deceive. Okay, so three things. You're asserting something false, you have know that you're asserting something false, and you are intending to deceive. Okay, so my tests are based on these three characteristics.
Hmm.
But before I come to my test, the evolutionary advantage for self-protection. We are built for survival. Now, supposing you know that the consequences, like Krishna says, Maya maine makan khai,
Hmm.
telling a lie, right? Maybe telling a lie in legend. Okay. So, anyway, so one is that it's a survival strategy. You
Hmm.
want to avoid danger to yourself,
Yeah.
right? So that's one. Second, and that's a very important evolutionary reason. But this Saint Augustine actually made a list of lies, 8 types of lies, and he said that the real lie, what he called a real lie, is the one where you take pleasure in lying. That is, it's not just that you deceive people for self-protection, you get a
Hmm.
kick out of it. So
Hmm.
the question is, why do you get a kick out of it? So when I started investigating these, I found that there are 2 types of lies. And I will call them, just for short, in short form, literary lie and non-literary lie. So we don't like the liar who intends to deceive. But if you tell a story, we know it's false.
Hmm.
And yet, we and the people know it's false, but it is a socially sanctioned form of the lie.
Okay.
Some metaphor: you are a flower, that's a socially, or you are a lion, that's a socially sanctioned form of the lie. There are two types of lies: one which is castigated because you have intended to deceive somebody.
Mm.
The other is socially sanctioned, and that's the large bunch. It contains narrative, metaphor, all these things. They are false, but you do not meet the third criteria, which is intention to deceive. Now, the one
Okay.
we don't like is the intention to deceive. What we do like is listening to stories. And I can tell you the evolutionary advantage of stories, because that's huge.
Yeah.
So, in other words, you learn to lie. Every child has told their first lie, except in few cases of autism, etc.
Mm.
By the age of 4, as soon as language develops, you develop the consciousness of other people, and that
Yeah.
other people, you can take advantage of them, etc. So children lie, and they, at the same time, they develop the capacity to listen to stories and differentiate between imaginary universes and real universes. So language gives us that huge range of
Mm.
things. And literary stories are, to go back to your earlier point, creative. They're very, very creative. So
Yeah.
it's kind of exciting, because you have these things you don't like in the gali and the lie instance. You don't like those uses of language.
Yeah.
And then there are uses of language that you take great pleasure in: talking, exchanging thoughts, etc., and telling stories. That is the other type of lie. So we have both. And the wonderful thing about human beings is they have the gift of displacement. So you can imagine future times, past times, and you can therefore, for science, create futures, which you can then, uh, uh, sort of build into reality. So you can
Yeah.
imagine flight, and then you can build planes. But that act of imagination is linguistic, and it's also pre-linguistic, but it and then you can do the math and everything, which also forms language, and then move on to making a different world.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between speech and action, uh, which is why language is so closely linked to morality.
Mm.
You can lie in language, you can insult people in language. Most of language and morality, language and ethics is negotiated.
Yeah.
I have to know what your perspective is from your culture. That all is done by language. And laws of the land, the constitution, all done linguistically. Then you have to interpret it. Then you have to decide what is moral, what is not immoral, come to consensus. All that, these structures, large social structures, sort of really accomplished linguistic.
Yeah. You were talking about these imaginative realities, these fragments of imagination wherein it is a part of a wonderful lie. Like, it's wonderful that it is the first time that someone has
Mm,
told me that it is a lie, and I'm thinking about it as a lie right now. Otherwise, it was just a wonderful part of a universe where
mm,
all
mm,
the storytelling thing happens. So
mm,
yeah.
mm. But there's a continuum, there's a
Yeah.
string.
Yeah.
So it is very hard to believe that you can, like autistic children, because they don't have some of these sensors of communication, pretend play is more difficult for them. And
Hmm.
that means participating in storytelling activity is more difficult and challenging. And so the capacity to tell lies is linked to other forms of linguistic creativity. And
Yeah.
that's why I like to think in terms of, what you and I share and continuums, rather than to say this is the language module and something goes into the black box and something comes out of the black
Yes.
box, because of course that happens. The head is a black box, but slowly it's becoming kind of translucent, and
Yeah.
we're trying to understand it. But human beings, you and I, are not brains in a vat. That is, we
Hmm.
are not just our brains kind of remotely connected to the outside world. Nature designed us to be packed close together. Our cells, our desires, our thoughts, our hatreds, all packed into the frame of your body.
Yeah.
And that's why crossover regions are really important.
Yeah.
Love making, all these things depend on so much of contact. So if machines are our next generation, we have to think of these problems of embodiment, of contact, of how we've done it, how nature has designed us, and how now we want to design nature.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that those are twin moral problems,
Hmm.
ethical problems.
Yes.